Hello and welcome! I decided to be brave today and paint a girl on a swing in loose expressive watercolour. I say brave because painting a child, a girl or any figure can be intimidating, but since a girl on a swing is one of the most joyful things I can think of to paint, it is well worth the effort. As is most typical for me, I'm drawing directly onto my watercolour paper. It's important to get the proportions right for the figure to read well, so I do need a pencil outline. But that's all I want from the drawing stage. The outline of the figure to get the proportions right and place the figure of the child and the swing in the best spot relative to the other elements in the composition, which are very simple. I chose this girl on a swing because I really like the contrast of her light shirt and her fair hair against the dark background. I do have a bit of a soft spot for sunlight dancing in the hair of children, and an image with strong contrast like this gives me a chance to show that off, especially with watercolour. With that in mind, I know I need to start with the light areas and leave her hair and head and shirt very pale with very little paint as the highlight sections, and then place strong dark bolds around her head and shirt with the foliage later on. Now, as usual, I'm really not that bothered about sticking to exactly the colours that I see in the reference that I'm working from, but I do want to keep her shirt white, nice and light and pale, so you might be surprised to see just how much colour I've put into that shirt. What I'm really painting is all the lovely wrinkles and crinkles in her shirt, and she's got quite a lovely body pose there because she's at that point in swinging where her little body is pushing forward to try and go higher and higher, and I love that, and so I do want to try and capture that, and the only way to do it is with the shading. So I'm using soft blues and lilacs to add in the shading that's coming from not only the shape of her body but also the wrinkles in her shirt. There's a sweet little path in the foreground of this composition, and one of the things I really liked about this image is just how simple the background can be, so that I can make this sweet little girl really be the focus of the painting. But I put in the path with a nice pale colour, and I'm linking that in different places. The soles of her little boots, because of course those are never pristine white, and I'm using that same colour for the path, the soles of her feet, and to pop into that lovely tree on the left hand side, which has also got a bit of colour in it. And I'm taking a few liberties with that colour again, because in the image there are some nice golds, but I want to use some of the pinky violets that I'm using in this little girl's boots, and I'm also going to put that colour in her skirt. I think she's wearing a black skirt. I don't like children wearing black clothes, it's not cheerful enough for me, so I'm putting her skirt in as a nice pinky violet, and I'm repeating some of that colour into the flowering tree on the left hand side. Now those little boots have got rather a charming highlight on them, where the light is catching on the right hand side of her, it'll be her right foot I suppose, because she's facing the same way as we are, isn't she? And so at the moment that is just unpainted paper, that little part of her right foot, so we won't see the edge of her foot until we paint in the background, so that will have to happen a little bit later. Now, if the idea of painting a figure is a little bit daunting to you, I'll bet it's just because you don't actually paint them very often, and really learning to draw and paint anything is just a matter of practice and familiarity. I've got quite a few videos on this topic because it's one of my favourite things to talk about, and I'll pop a card in the top right of the screen to some other videos that will give you some help getting started learning to draw figures to add to your paintings, just in case you want to watch those next after you see how this little girl turns out. Now the background area in this painting is nice and simple, but I don't want it to be totally boring, so I'm making sure that I use the watercolour to its full effect to put in lots of passages of light and shadow in the grass and under that lovely flowering tree. Now, one of the other things that I can see in the background, because I don't want it to be too boring, is I think they're the glinting edges of some tree trunks. So I want to pop in a bit of the same colour that I used as the pale colour for her shoes and the path into little places here and there, just to make sure that I've got some places to use to be those light areas when it comes to filling in the rest of this background. And painting the background is really when you are painting the rest of the figure, because I'm painting her negatively on all the sides where the highlights are catching on her little hands and feet particularly. So this is where I've got to be a little bit careful and paint around her hands and around her face. So it's kind of a nerve-wracking part of the painting, I have to be honest, because you kind of develop a bit of a fondness for your little subject, and the more you like her, the less you want to mess her up. But she's not going to stand out from her background until I put in all these luscious dark leaves around her sweet little face. So now that I'm painting in these dark leaves around her, we'll see that her little boot appears as we paint the boot by painting the background. And apart from the edges around the little girl, which have to be quite careful and precise, painting the rest of the background is quite fun, because I'm obviously not trying to paint every single leaf and branch. I am really letting the properties of the paint and water create those lovely effects in the background, because it is the background, so you want it nice and soft. And this is where watercolour really comes into its own, because those marks will soften into each other if the paint is still damp, and the colours will blend beautifully. Now there's lots of really important little negative shapes that I've got to put in here, like this little shape that the crook of her arm makes between her body and the chain of the swing, for example, and underneath her elbow the same sort of thing. So I've got to have nice strong juicy paint and confident lines to fill in those little gaps there so that she stands proud of the background. Oh, she's a little sweetheart, isn't she? I want to run around and see her smiling face, but you know that you'd be kind of interrupting her happy private moment if you did that, don't you? Anyway, let's have a look at what she needs to be finished off. I think perhaps some shadows across the ground there, and I'm going to use the same sort of purpley colours, the soft blues that I put in her shirt. And when I do that, I realise I want a little bit more visual interest in her body itself. She looks a little bit flat still, and I love that arch of her body, and the only way that I can get that in is with a few more points of visual interest and a bit more shading. So I'm looking for the strong darks, like at the neckline and where her elbows touch her body, or I suppose where her armpit is. And just putting in these tiny dark marks gives her shirt a little bit more definition, and her arm needs a bit of shape. So I was a bit bold there in the first place, but I managed to blot it out just to get a bit more of the curve that I was looking for. And there are some important darks where her little hands are gripping those chains, so I want to put those in. Hands are tricky to draw, but on a little sort of loose, expressive figure like this, it's really just getting those main shapes and the main lights and darks, and she will pretty much appear. Now that it's the contrast that we said was so important in this image, so I'm just making sure that my lightest areas are next to my darkest areas around my focal point there, which is my little girl. And there she is. Thanks for watching. See you next time.